start off with what I'm sometimes asked to do as an expert witness, which is to advise the court, could the defendant's autism have contributed to the alleged offence? So that's the kind of key question. And as an expert witness, you're not on the side of the defence or the prosecution. I'm a psychologist, but I'm brought in to advise the court and advise the jury if it's a court with a jury. And so what you can see on this slide is these are the sorts of characteristics of autistic people that might sometimes lead them to behave in certain ways, that might lead them to cross a line, which involves breaking a law. And social naivety is at the top of the list. That we know that that's part of being autistic, is that you may not realize that other people are trying to cheat you, other people are trying to manipulate you. Communication and empathy difficulties can be part of autism. And you can see in that top line, the phrase theory of mind, whether you can imagine what someone is thinking, what they're intending, what they're wanting. Autistic people sometimes have trouble keeping track of all of that. And so they could end up being put into a situation where they never realized they were going to end up in trouble by people who are maybe just a bit socially more savvy than they are. So that would be an example where their disability contributed to why they were in the situation that ended up where they were arrested, perhaps. Being exploited, being groomed, being manipulated, I've already mentioned. Another quality or characteristic of autism is that many autistic people are obsessive. They find it interesting to go deeper and deeper into one topic. In many fields of work or life, that would be seen as a strength, that you're becoming an expert in something. But that kind of obsessive approach to the world and to learning about information, sometimes accompanied by narrow attention, so not looking at the big picture, but looking at really kind of a niche subject, sometimes called tunnel vision, could mean that the person has become so over-focused that all they can really see is their own perspective and not think about how their behavior might be viewed by others. Other characteristics of autism might include being solitary. So whereas somebody who's not autistic might have a circle of friends they can talk to, or might be in touch with family, or might be quite happy to go into an advice center to get advice on what should I do and to check other perspectives. Some autistic people feel quite overwhelmed and intimidated by that prospect. They don't like chatting to other people. They like to keep themselves to themselves, but it means that they can end up, the risk anyway, is that they can end up just with their own viewpoint and not necessarily imagining how other people might see them. You can see two other points on this slide. Binary black and white thinking. It's something that autistic people sometimes show. They may not be thinking about shades of gray or in a more nuanced way, because autistic people often like precision. They like facts rather than opinions or conjecture or ambiguity. But that black and white thinking might lead them to a conclusion that something is either right or wrong, and not check with others, not, see alternative possibilities, alternative options. And the last point, and I'll come on to this when I talk about some examples, is of autistic people who may, when they're feeling trapped in a situation, maybe figuring out what shall I do. They don't talk to a friend, they don't talk to a lawyer, they don't talk to the police or get advice. They just try and take a logical approach and try and figure out a way out of the situation. And sometimes that can involve acting in ways that cross a line legally. So these are some of the sorts of things I might be thinking about as a psychologist when I'm looking at a defendant who either had a pre-existing diagnosis of autism, or their legal team have raised the question, might the defendant be undiagnosed but need a diagnosis because it may have contributed to the alleged offence? Let's see if I can get on to the next slide. What I was going to do is take you through 3 or 4 examples. I can disclose the details because they've all been in the public domain, but many of you know the case of Gary McKinnon, who hacked into US government computers just after 9/11, but he did it from the bedroom in his mother's house in North London. He was not interested in committing a crime, as far as we could establish. He was simply searching for information that he thought might be in the public good. And in an obsessive way, he just kept going and found he was able to hack into the Pentagon. Suggests that the Pentagon's computer systems were not that secure. As it turns out, in any computer network, there's often one computer that doesn't have a password, and he was able to just keep getting through layers of computer networks to go all the way into the Pentagon. Many of you know this case because under the extradition treaty laws, maybe the lawyers on in this panel will say more about this. If you commit an alleged crime in the US from any other country, but particularly from the UK, the UK is obliged to hand you over to stand trial in the US. You can see Theresa May here. She was Home Secretary at the time, and she refused to hand him over in the end. So whatever you thought of her as a Prime Minister, I think in this particular instance, listening to the evidence about his autism, a diagnosis that was disputed by the prosecution, but there was plenty of evidence for it. A lot of expert witnesses independently agreed he was autistic. You can see him there with his mother, who fought the campaign with him, and the then President Obama, and the extradition was blocked. He was never sent to America to stand trial. He never went to prison, but he did lose 10 years of his life whilst that case was being discussed. Laurie Love was a very similar case, another English young man, computer scientist, who faced extradition to the US again for alleged involvement in online protests. He was alleged to have been hacking into government websites, including military ones, where he was alleged to have posted videos. This is certainly showing that if it was true that he had talents, you can see the details of his case. But again, the UK government, they ran the trials in this country to decide should they hand him over to the US. And after many years, he too was pleased to discover that he wasn't going to be extradited. Both Gary McKinnon and Laurie Love were in real fear of being handed over to an American prison and an American legal system, because American prisons can be very harsh environments for anyone, but for an autistic person with their sensory issues very often, with their difficulties in sharing a cell with another person, their difficulties in dealing with unexpected change, the stress levels could have been so bad that both Gary and Laurie said that if they were extradited, they would take their own lives. They would prefer to die than to go to an American prison. So those are 2 cases I thought you might be interested to hear about. A very different case was Navinda Sarao, again, living in South London, who was prosecuted in America for causing the flash crash by manipulating the stock market. So basically what was seen was that the US markets went down by 9% in 36 minutes. This was back in 2010, a loss of $1 trillion. And it was alleged that he had made, as a trader, he'd made $40 million during that flash crash. So, he was accused of of engineering a crash in the stock market. When I interviewed him in prison and conducted the diagnostic assessment to see if autism applied, there was no doubt at all that he was autistic. Doing the assessment inside a prison wasn't easy, but he was a very clear-cut example of autism. Initially, he was pleading not guilty. He later did plead guilty to some offences, modifying trading software, for example. But in this instance, the American government and prosecution decided that he was so disabled and suffering by not being with his family in London that they returned him to the UK, and he was required to stay at home for 1 year. He had made 40 million quid or dollars, but interestingly, when just to show his naivety, when he made that money, somebody approached him, not through Zoom, to say, "Do you want to invest it?" He didn't. And we can invest it and give you a decent return. He didn't check whether they were genuine, and that was the last he saw of his money. So we see the kind of two sides of autism: the talent at trading, but also the social naivety. This was a rather grim story. Simon Thompson, who murdered his daughter Rebecca, aged 11, in Bushey, where they were living. And this was a situation of a man who had never done anything wrong in his life, never had a parking ticket, never turned left in a no left turn street, completely, zero convictions, and then ends up murdering his daughter. And I met him in prison, checked whether he might be autistic on the sort of request of his defense lawyer. Again, very clear that he'd lived a very solitary life, had no friends, but his situation was that he was divorcing the child's mother, and the little girl said to him, "Daddy, please do something, because I don't want to have another daddy. Please do something to help me." And left alone and in his kind of tormented state, he thought that the kindest thing he could do was what he called a mercy killing, so that she wouldn't suffer. And he strangled her in her bed at night. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, which many of you might think was, a reasonable sentence, given that he'd taken the life of another person. But actually, the conviction was commuted from murder to manslaughter on the basis of diminished responsibility. He actually thought he was doing the right thing. He thought that his daughter didn't suffer because he'd researched how to make it as painless as possible. But this was a really grim case, but I'm just showing you the range of types of cases that I've been involved in. So sometimes what I'm asked to do, and I'll just kind of wind up with the more legal aspects, is to consider, is the defendant fit to plead? So can they understand the charges? Can they decide whether to plead guilty or innocent? Can they exercise a right to challenge jurors? And actually, you'll probably hear more from Felicity, but actually the bar is quite high. You have to have a pretty severe disability to not be fit to plead. That's because the courts want to make sure that the courts are accessible for the widest number of people, so that you do get your time in court and do get an opportunity for justice. Another question that I'm often asked about is, can they participate effectively? Can they understand that they're in a courtroom? Can the person understand what's at stake in terms of what they say? Can they explain their version of events? And again, some autistic people may be able to do that. Some autistic people may really struggle with some of these things, being cross-examined, being able to give evidence, realizing that they're allowed to disagree with statements that are made about them. We shouldn't assume that an autistic person understands the sorts of communication that goes on in a courtroom the way a non-autistic person might. Another consideration might be, should the courts be taking any special measures or making any reasonable adjustments for someone with a disability? And a very simple one might be that if the defendant is confused by the judge wearing a wig, why is this person wearing a wig? It doesn't cost much to ask the judge just to remove the wig so that the autistic defendant can concentrate on the more important issues. Some autistic people might be overwhelmed by the social and the sensory factors in the courtroom and may need to be interviewed in a separate room. They may need to be interviewed by camera rather than face to face. The barristers involved might be asked to avoid ambiguous questions and instead use questions which are close-ended rather than open-ended. So just require a yes or no answer rather than being asked to express an opinion. So a number of things that autistic people might struggle with, which would be small, low-cost, reasonable adjustments to make sure that they can participate in the court. So just to kind of wrap up, because I know we've got a lot to get through. It's not that autism, if the defendant does need a diagnosis or has a diagnosis, is a get out of jail card, but it is only fair, only just to take into account the defendant's autism, to make reasonable adjustments, to make sure that the person is getting a fair trial and is getting access to the same rights, the same human rights that everybody else enjoys. I want to just thank the Autism Research Trust, who are funding a research project at the moment looking at autism and the criminal justice system. We're doing this through lawyers, through a survey, and also through autistic people, hundreds of them, who've been arrested to find out what their experience was. I'm going to stop screen sharing. And Lewis, I don't know whether you want to have a little discussion about this first or go straight into the next.
Thank you, Simon. Fascinating, and those case studies are so concerning and so worrying, aren't they? And I know we're going to look in more detail at the case of Alex Henry shortly.
Yeah.
But John Bartlett, I'd like to bring you in now if I can. As I mentioned earlier, you were sentenced to 6 years in prison and then subsequently diagnosed with autism. Did a lot of what Simon said just then resonate with you? Tell us, if you can, a little bit about your own experiences.
Right. Well, I've written a few notes that my wife is shining a torch on for me, because I'll forget everything as soon as I'm under stress. My mind just goes blank, which was one of the problems in court. I'm getting on for 66 now. I was diagnosed with autism and ADHD back in 2017. And because the Criminal Case Review Committee have been investigating my case, I've now been independently diagnosed 3 times by various different people: Clifford Robbins, Dr. Carol Stott, and recently Dr. Harry Wood, who's a forensic psychologist. He was doing this for the Criminal Case Review Committee for me. Basically, in 1995, I was sentenced, as you mentioned, to a total of 6 years in prison. That was 4 years and a further 2 years if I didn't pay £91,000 in compensation. It was a fairly complicated trial that went on for some 2 months. It's far too complicated to go into here, and probably not that relevant. But I was found guilty of insurance fraud, which followed an accident where I broke my back in 2 places. And the collapse of my team, my racing team, at the end of the 1980s, early 90s, when the big recession was going on. My experience of the criminal justice system is very much that the system is utterly clueless when it comes to any learning disabilities, autism, ADHD. That they're so intent on securing a conviction, and the trial process is so one-sided that, in my opinion, they're just prepared to pervert the course of justice to secure their objectives. As I say, I was diagnosed back in 2017, but I'd always wondered if there was something not quite right. But people that are born with autism, ADHD, basically we see the world the way it is, which is normal. We don't know that we've got it. It was only much later after the trial when my son, youngest son, who's also autistic, attempted to hang himself, that he was diagnosed, and I was diagnosed. We realized that obviously we had these issues. What was I going to say? I was going to say, but the little bit of the background, I was always considered to be, when I was young, I was considered to be a bit of a difficult child, a loner. I got bored really, really easily. I had a fairly privileged childhood. I was brought up by nannies, which didn't help, but because I was into everything and had a tendency to pull everything apart to see how things worked, I got sent off to boarding school. I didn't have friends. I was constantly beaten by the teachers to try and knock sense into me. I had a weird thing in that my pain threshold has since been, I've been told, is extremely high, which is something to do with autism, I believe. So when I was beaten, I used to get beaten to the point where I was bleeding by the teachers. And they put me in a boxing ring to knock sense into me as well. None of which actually worked. By 18, well, I left school at 15, but by the age of 18, I was employing about 25, 30 people. So I had no qualifications, whatever, but I went on to develop smoke detectors, which most people have in their houses now. That was in the early 70s. And then, again, I'm told that I'm very bit unconventional, and I sort of, what's the word? I don't know, impulsive. I sort of walked away from the factory with all the potential money and the Aston Martin that I was driving then when I was 20, just walked away from it all to go into professional motorsport, because that's what I really wanted to do. I had this accident, which was a riding accident where I broke my back. It wasn't in a race car, but at that point, the race team was collapsing in the recession. Nothing was clear. I didn't know what I could do. Basically, I wanted to hang on to my old life, although doctors were saying you can't do this anymore because the lower part, 2 vertebrae, were smashed. But I tried to get back into it, and the insurers and so on, all that lot resulted in me being raided by the police 27 years ago. We weren't present. My mother was there, who's 80, and she had a stroke when they raided the house. The insurance companies, incidentally, were PPI companies. First time that everybody in the late 80s, early 90s was buying this sort of insurance for protection. Nobody at that time really knew what PPI stood for, but now I think everybody knows. It was a little bit sort of underhand. I got raided then a second time. What actually triggered the raid was the insurers had me watched by private detectives because I had reported them to the BBC Watchdog programme, who'd done a big expose on them. So they sort of wanted to have a go at me. They started watching the house. They said that I was out riding horses and mucking out stables, but in fact, what they didn't realise was that they were watching a different property. And it was later proved that they'd actually been, the surveillance had been with the wrong people. But obviously, as a result of that, my mother had a stroke, and then we got raided a second time because the Metropolitan Police realised what the mistake. And on that occasion,
can I just ask? Sorry to interrupt. Looking back now, do you see traits of your autism that was very evident throughout that? Because of course you were sentenced in 1995, but not diagnosed until 2017. Looking back, do you see a pattern of behaviour that sort of confirms your autism?
When I look back now, yes, I look back at a lot of the stuff and it makes a huge amount of sense. Yeah, but yeah. I mean, I'm also dyslexic, and that was a massive problem when I was trying to keep up with thousands of documents. An expert in court explained that I had a spelling age of an 8-year-old, a reading age of an 11-year-old, but an unusually high IQ that was in the top 10% of the population. The trial judge simply didn't seem to be able to understand that, which is why I say that, you know, they don't seem to follow any of these issues. He couldn't understand the discrepancy between the high IQ and the fact that I seemed to be able to memorize thousands of documents, but I couldn't keep up with things when, like, the prosecution barrister would say things like, "You did such and such, did you not?" Because by the time I tried to untangle the "did you not," where did that go, I'd missed the next series of questions. And then going round and round in my head, I've got this, did I answer that right? Which, you know, and you just get completely lost. I was found guilty, as you know. I ended up in Graylingwell, a sort of mental hospital. The judge wouldn't accept the mental hospital's pre-sentence report. They'd phoned the judge. We've got proof of all this now, to say this chap should not be put in prison. He's not fit to serve a sentence. They sent him pre-sentence reports, and on the 4th of February 95, the judge basically just threw the thing to one side and said, I think we can safely assume Mr. Bartlett has recovered from his little breakdown.
John, thank you. I mean, what a story, and you know, it's incredibly daunting and difficult for you. I'm sure there may be some questions on your experiences later. I'd like to move on now, if I may, to Sally Housel and Charlotte Henry. As I mentioned in the beginning, Alex was sentenced to 19 years in prison for murder by joint enterprise, and was subsequently diagnosed by Professor Baron Cohen with autism. It's obviously a very harrowing story for you, but Sally, do you want to take us back to that awful day on August the 6th, 2013?
Well, actually, Charlotte's going to go through the facts of the case. Oh. She has better memory than me for the little details of what happened. And then I'll talk about what it was like bringing Alex up, about 5 minutes each, if that's okay.
Sure, thank you.
Okay.
Yes, it was the 6th of August 2013. My brother was out shopping with 3 friends, Cameron Ferguson, Janelle Grant Murray and Eunice Tayyib. he came out of a shop with Cameron Ferguson to see Janelle circled by a group of 4 older men across the road. And this is captured on CCTV. Alex coming out of the shop, walking up the road, and you can see the moment that he sees something in the distance. He runs in and the violence erupts around him. There's violence on both sides. So my brother's involvement was the throwing of the mobile phone at the victim and a punch at another victim. But just after that victim, on his own evidence, had actually punched Janelle. So fists are flying. The actual argument that started it was just a look. One of the victims gave a look at Janelle, or Janelle says the victim the victim said that Janelle gave him a look. But it was sparked by no more than a look. They weren't gang members, they were strangers and hadn't met one another before. The boy that ran out of the shop behind my brother, Cameron Ferguson, he had a knife in his bag, and he put his hand inside the JD Sports bag and used the knife while it remained inside the bag. Now, he stabbed 2 people. He stabbed Borhain Kaziki and Taki Kaziki, and Taki died shortly afterwards from his injury. Cameron Ferguson, the violence lasted only 47 seconds, so it was a very fast-moving and quick, spontaneous event. My brother ran in with Cameron behind him. Cameron stabs the 2 people in a shorter time frame than 47 seconds because he actually leaves halfway through and disappears down a road by himself. My brother grabs Janelle and runs away, pursued a very short distance by the victims. And they run back to the shopping centre and begin walking through the shopping centre while Alex is assessing Janelle's injuries. Janelle is saying, "Why didn't you back me up? Where were you?" Alex is saying, "I did, I threw your phone." Janelle's saying, "Well, where's my phone?" And Alex is saying, "Well, no, your phone's broken, I'm assuming, on the floor." They walk to the park and they call Eunice, Taib and Cameron. Cameron's phone is off. They can't get hold of him and they don't know where he's gone and why he would have disappeared, because they don't know at this point that anyone's been stabbed. Eunice has actually gone home because the fight had happened outside of his mum's house, and his mum had came out in the midst of it and demanded he get back inside the house. So that's where he was, and he came to the park to meet Alex and Janelle afterwards. They, what was always the plan was they were going to go to the youth centre and spend the time there for the rest of the evening. So they left the park and all travelled to the youth centre. And when they get out of the taxi, they go towards the youth centre. Cameron Ferguson is there. Janelle says, "Where were you? Why didn't you back me?" And Cameron said, "I did, I stabbed them," or words to that effect, but slang. Eunice Taib goes and hands himself into the police immediately. Shortly after, a couple of days after, Janelle hands himself in. Alex doesn't hand himself in. Alex goes on into hiding with the stabber, Cameron Ferguson, and that was something that was very damaging at trial. The reason for that was on the Friday, it was his girlfriend's scan. It was their first child. It was her 12-week scan, her pregnancy scan. And so he had promised her that he was going to be at that scan with her at the hospital. So he went into hiding to avoid arrest because in his view, he had to attend the scan. And I know that because he called me the day after. He wouldn't tell me what it was. He said for the first time that his girlfriend was actually pregnant because no one else knew. He asked me to pick him up and would give me an address, take him to the scan, and then take him to the police station. I asked what it was and he wouldn't tell me, and told me he would tell me once he got to the station. So I know that as being true. And those are the facts of the case. He was arrested on the Thursday, charged with murder and later convicted, but I'll leave the law surrounding how he became convicted and then the relevance of his autism diagnosis to his barrister, Felicity Gerry, QC.
I was just going to describe to people who might wonder what it was like, what Alex was like as a child growing up. And, you know, sometimes it's helpful for people to hear in case they can spot things in their own children. I first noticed Alex had difficulties when he was under 2, just under 2. And I remember telling the health visitor, and she came around the house, and Alex leapt on the table in front of her, and she said, he is overactive, but he's not hyperactive. You must never confuse the two. And that was it. And then when he was in the age 2 and going forward, he had tantrums that went on, and they just didn't stop, and they were much more excessive. He seemed to be in so much distress that at one point I found it difficult to leave the house unless someone would stay in the house and look after him. And that was 2 and 3. And then he went to primary school, and for about just under a year, he seemed to do okay. And the teacher said she was very impressed with his maths skills. And I remember feeling really chuffed. And then he was terribly bullied to the point where he broke his leg. And he got very distressed going into school. So I rang up the local authority and demanded to speak to the educational psychologist, and I would ring every day or even several times a day. And in the end, she said to me, he just has a school phobia, but she never met him. So by that time, we had to take him out of school because we were just so worried about him. He was only 6 then, and he was really distressed. And eventually we had, after lots of letters from the local authority and phone calls to say they would fine us, they would take us to court if we didn't let him go into school. We paid to put him into a private school, and they tried really hard with him, and it was hard for them. But eventually, after a couple of years or so, he was excluded from school. And the teachers, I must say, throughout his life, spoke, and this was more so in the States primary school where he developed his phobia. They spoke to me about him, and in front of the class, really scathingly, as if they really disliked him. And I picked this up at open evenings, and it was really distressing. And when we pulled him out of school, I remember it was the day when the teacher said to him, shouted at him for not doing his homework, was really nasty to him in front of the class. And he came home crying, and I thought, I can't do this to him anymore. And so then he entered Charlotte Secondary School, but only after an appeal that we had, and we won the appeal, and they let him in, but they didn't want to let him in. And within the first term, they expelled him. And after that, he wasn't included in anything. It was like he'd fallen off society's radar. No one followed him up. And I would be constantly on the phone. It became almost that they thought I was obsessed, and I suppose I was obsessed, because all I wanted to do was to find out why my son had these difficulties, why he couldn't be accepted by people, why he didn't seem to communicate with me properly, why I couldn't get through to him. And I used to say to the psychologist, it's like he's wrapped in cellophane, literally loads and loads of cellophane all around him, and even when I'm distressed, he doesn't get it. And he'd look really puzzled at me. So as he entered his teenage years, of course, it got harder. And while I'm at work, because I had a mortgage to pay, I had to work. And while I'm at work, he's just roaming the streets. He was offered a study centre to go to school, bearing in mind they threw him out the last time when he was just 13. So all of those years, he's just roaming the streets. And he was said to me, Mum, I can't go to the study centre. The boys there are really, really dangerous. I can't go, it's really frightening for me. And so He ended up just hanging around on the streets. No one cared about him. No one followed up. I begged psychologists to see him, and he had a few assessments. And they'd say things like, oh, he's mildly depressed, he's anxious. He doesn't give me eye contact. Maybe I'll follow this up. And I look back now and I am furious. I am furious with the fact that they did this to my son. And they're not going to get away with this. This is disgraceful. And I would say to anyone out there with any power at all, anywhere, you must stop this from happening. There are so many children that are thrown out of school and they are just forgotten. They're discarded by society. They're thrown out of school and they're put in prison. And under the gift that CPS have, which is joint enterprise, that's a gift to them because they can get all of these vulnerable people. We've had blind children. We've had ADHD, autism, they're all caught under the net of joint enterprise because the CPS don't need any evidence. In fact, that child, and often their children, doesn't even need to be present. It's absolutely disgraceful. This country should be ashamed of itself. So I'm going to stop there because I'm really emotional now. But it's just something that must stop. And I would like to say thank you to Jengba, our campaign group, for giving me and Charlotte a voice and a platform. And thank you so much to everyone here for having us today, and for our lovely expert witness and Felicity, our lovely QC, and everybody together, they just save us because every day is a battle to carry on, but we have to carry on for Alex.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you for sharing that, which is incredibly painful for you, I know. Well, let's lead on to Felicity Gary QC and
Charlotte, did you want to say something? No? Okay, sorry, yeah.
Okay, Felicity, who I understand you've just submitted a request for a royal prerogative of mercy for Alex. Could you just tell us a little bit more about your work with Alex's case, joint enterprise, and anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think probably I haven't got any slides because I didn't want to give everyone a law lecture. So I think probably the way for me to pick up the threads of what everyone has said is to think about the importance of understanding disability. So the criminal justice system has made some moves in that direction, and we heard about Simon's involvement in cases where we've tried to assess whether people can effectively participate in the proceedings and be enabled to communicate and to understand the questions that they're being asked through special measures, and assessing people as to whether or not they're fit to plead in order to participate. And I think that's very important, that we need to ensure that people living with autism are enabled to engage in the process. That said, the criminal justice system has not made so many efforts in that regard in relation to how the law works, criminal law works, for people who live with autism. So trying to keep it simple, when there's an alleged offence, what we do in the law is we break that down into what people do and what their state of mind is at the time. And we have different tests: knowledge, intention, foresight. And unless we can understand the characteristics of that person themselves, there is a real risk that the proceedings are generalized to make them the mainstream public, if you like. That's a dreadful expression, generalized to people who don't live with autism. And there is a real problem recognizing that autism might impact on people's ability to know or foresee what's going on, or indeed intend to do what they're alleged to have done. And then if we think about criminal defences, so we think about things like, we heard about diminished responsibility. Often that's applied where someone is thought to have a form of mental impairment or mental illness, which autism doesn't fall into. So we haven't extended diminished responsibility to people with cognitive difficulties that don't amount to traditionally viewed mental impairment. And we we now think about cases involving trafficked persons who might have their vulnerability abused, and we might just be able to think about how people living with autism might be exploited. But grooming isn't necessarily a defence to a criminal offence. So there's only a limited way in which certain people might be able to have the benefit of the defence for trafficked persons. And at the moment, the law excludes a load of serious offences like murder. And we can easily see how someone could be alleged to be an accessory to murder and they live with autism. So joint enterprise in particular, yes.
Could you just very briefly, a couple of points on the questions. Could you just briefly explain what joint enterprise is, just so people have a good understanding of what
getting there. Right. So joint enterprise brings together all of these issues, because you've got if we think about it in the context of murder or manslaughter, you've got a prosecution that wants to prove those offences, and you've got a defendant who has very limited access to any defence that is bespoke to autism. So you're trying to think about how did the autism mind. Now, before a case called Jogi, which is Alex's case falls into, case of Jogi was decided in 2016. One way in which the prosecution could prove that someone was complicit in someone else's crime, which is what joint enterprise is really about, is someone an accessory to a crime that someone else has done. Unfortunately, and that's putting it mildly, the courts had ignored about 500 years of law and created a situation where defendants could be convicted of very serious offences on the basis that they foresaw the possibility of what someone else might do. And that's not all the detail of the law, but it's the relevant part for Alex's case, because how does someone with autism foresee the possibility of what someone else might do? Can we be confident that a conviction on that basis is safe? My answer would be no. It's not the correct law anyway, and that law was corrected by the case of Jogi. But what it means is that people like Alex are serving prison sentences that are particularly torturous for people living with autism for offences that they did not intend and where they didn't necessarily know the essential facts of what they were getting involved in. And we can see that clearly in Alex's case, that there would have been an opportunity, had the jury known about his autism, because of course he was diagnosed after his conviction, that they could really seriously consider whether he knew or intended or foresaw what was being alleged in something as serious as murder. So for those cases, there are now about 1,000 people in prison who were wrongly convicted on the wrong law, and a portion of them, as well as Alex, I suspect, have cognitive difficulties that weren't considered in the trial at all. After Jogi, where that specific form of liability, I haven't given you all the details, that was known as joint enterprise, the legal phrase is parasitic accessorial liability, so you can see why I'm not going into detail. Once that was expunged or got rid of, we still have a law of complicity. So you have a principal offender who does the stabbing, for example, and then the question is, are the other people with him, I'll use him for the sake of argument, complicit in his crime? Have they assisted or encouraged in some way? And now the law is that you must know the essential facts, and frankly, this was the law for about 500 years, know the essential facts of what the other person is doing. You then assist and encourage in some way. So you're more than merely present at the scene. You're doing something that assist and encourage, and you intend to assist or encourage. And if someone goes beyond what you know is going to happen, if you like, your knowledge of the essential facts, the assessment of that is whether or not that what we call overwhelming supervening act is beyond the contemplation of the defendant. One has to put, and literally the test is putting yourself in the defendant's shoes. Could they contemplate what happens? So we can see in the context of murder, whether it's the elements of the offence or the defence, whether you're looking at diminished responsibility or the elements of complicity, without making it too legally complicated, there are all those areas where we're exploring the state of mind of a person whose autism may well impact on those decisions. So it's always necessary as a lawyer to have some expertise around what we call vulnerability. Can we identify someone with an issue? And as you can hear, experts along the way in Sally's case failed to identify that Alex was living with autism. Terribly, when Simon did identify it and Alex's case was taken on appeal, the Court of Appeal not only misclassified autism as a mental illness, but rejected Simon's diagnosis without any other expert evidence, based on their own assessment from pretty much from the evidence in the case rather than from Simon's expert diagnosis, and appallingly, in my opinion, rejected the evidence that Alex was indeed living with autism. And that meant that the consequence was that Simon's evidence was not part of the appeal itself, because that fresh evidence was not admitted, because it was not accepted that Alex was autistic, and then his appeal was rejected on other grounds. So it was an appalling situation where the Court of Appeal had the opportunity to address how the law of complicity works in relation to people living with autism, and they didn't do that. The consequence of which is Alex is still in prison, living with autism, and prison conditions, as we heard from John, are particularly torturous for people living with autism. We heard the fear factor in Gary McKinnon case that you're going to lose your client to self-harm. And it is an appalling miscarriage of justice that is systemic, that the system is failing to accommodate persons with disabilities in what I would call substantive law, in the legal approaches. Diminished responsibility isn't sufficient. Trafficking persons where you control other people, which obviously can arise in cases involving accessories, is not sufficient. The way in which we approach complicity risks failing to identify those persons who genuinely are not participating in the offence, but happen to be present or happen to demonstrate some challenging behaviour that might have something to do with their autism rather than the offence itself. So Alex's case is, in my opinion, a sort of modern textbook on how the criminal justice system fails persons with disability, particularly those persons with autism. And it's a miscarriage of justice and an injustice that I think we have a public duty to address, and is capable of being addressed through the petition of mercy that we drafted on his behalf. So that's filed, in fact, by his solicitor, Dean Kingham. It's litigation, so I draft it, Dean files it, and hopefully the public will support it. And what it does is express roughly what I've expressed today as to how that was a particular injustice for Alex. The courts will not recognise the potential for his innocence, nor the opportunity to give him a retrial, because frankly, that's pretty simple, isn't it? Let's have a retrial where a jury know that he's autistic, and then they can assess whether or not he committed the crime at all. Seems pretty basic to me. So we've set all that out in the petition to try and say, well, look, let's have another look at it. And the good news is the Ministry of Justice have referred his application for a pardon, which is really what it is, to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. So hopefully they will send us back to the Court of Appeal. Never mind the petition, let's go and get a conviction quashed. That would be lovely. So we're just waiting to see what happens. But I think his is a a terrible case, but a brilliant opportunity for the criminal justice system to change its approach to people living with autism. So I hope that goes some way to explaining why Alex's case is helpful to understand the law as it stands at the moment for people living with autism.
Thank you, Felicity, very much. Very, very clear. And yes, well, let's hope there's good news on the horizon. I'm conscious of time, and I'm also conscious that Simon has to leave relatively soon. So I'm going to hope to keep him engaged for a little bit longer, if I may, and just open this up to questions, discussions. Juliana, can I ask you to coordinate the questions? Have you got any questions that have come in from people?
Of course, yes, we have some questions here. So we have the first one here is wait, because there are like lots of messages here, but I'll be just a minute.
I think that there's one, Simon, that's in from Denise that says, is it harder to identify autism in women?
Thank you, Denise, for that question. It is a very important one because I think we now recognize that a lot of girls and women who may need a diagnosis get overlooked, or they get misdiagnosed with something else. So that could be for a number of reasons. It could be because clinicians are not very experienced at diagnosing autism in girls or women. It could be that females themselves are trying to hide their autism due to stigma, and they may actually be better than their male counterparts at camouflaging, as it's called. It could also be that clinicians get sort of misled by symptoms and just reach a different diagnosis. So, for example, a lot of women or girls who may be autistic may get diagnosed with social anxiety, or may get diagnosed with anorexia if they're just being very fussy with their eating and losing weight. All kinds of things could be kind of partly true, partly correct, but they nevertheless miss the underlying condition of autism, which would have been there from early development. Anorexia tends to start in the teens. Well, we heard, from Alex's mother that actually, in Alex's case, he had quite high levels of anxiety, but it wasn't just anxiety. The anxiety was an indicator of, as it turns out, underlying autism that was missed. So it's not just, autism isn't just missed in females, but it can sometimes be harder to diagnose.
Okay, we have one last question here. So do you think there are legitimate arguments for withholding an autism diagnosis from a jury and even possibly the judge?
I suppose that one's for me. It might very well depend on what the case is about. I'm going to give you an example. So people living with autism, I think it's why we need to understand the lived experience, because one of the things that Sally helped us with is that people living with autism can be really challenging. So they might have a long list of criminal convictions, and that might arise from a number of cases where their autism has not been identified. Now, sometimes in a criminal case, the prosecution might want to rely on someone's bad character. And in those circumstances, if there's an explanation for that bad character, that actually it might arise from the challenging behaviour of autism, you might want the court to know about that, so that if it's a criminal trial, the jury can understand that even those criminal convictions in the past that the prosecution are relying on to demonstrate a propensity to be violent, for example, may not at all. It may be as a result of a condition. But separately, if you have a different type of offence, if someone is accused of, and I have to say, I can't think of an example of at the moment, but if someone is accused of something maybe in the context of computer hacking, and they don't want the court to know that they have a particular set of skills, they do have a right to remain silent, and the prosecution have to prove their case. And there might be a forensic decision in a case to say, well, there's not sufficient evidence here to prove this case against this particular person, so they're entitled to remain silent. It's not our business to know everybody's private medical information. So there are some cases where you might make a decision that, okay, autism might be relevant to the prosecution, but it's not relevant in terms of presenting the defense case. And then there's some cases that fall in the middle ground. So you might have and usually they're cases of violence, and they might involve cases of sexual violence or offences using the internet. So you might have stalking behaviour on the internet, for example, or posting with non-consensual posting of images, those types of behaviour that involve understanding social nuance. And is it that this person has been violent or sexually violent or committed some sort of image abuse offence because they don't have social awareness? And Simon told us about social naivety. And in those circumstances, it would not be appropriate to withhold the autism diagnosis, because the court would need to understand why that behaviour was occurring. But that's a long way of saying, because we don't deal with autism in the criminal justice system in terms of what we understand about knowledge, intention and contemplation and those tests that we have for state of mind, it's not terribly clear when is it appropriate to share your private medical information as part of a criminal trial and when it's not. So it's really why the law needs to adjust to make sure that you're making the right decisions on behalf of someone who lives with a particular condition. So
thank you.
I imagine mostly it's relevant, but there are going to be some cases where it's not, would have been the short answer.
Well, thank you. I think Andrew had a question that he's just typed, but Andrew, do you want to verbalise your question?
Sorry, I was taken a bit surprised.
Go ahead.
It wasn't really a question. It was just a reflection, really, on the time at which people get picked up for a more detailed psychological evaluation in their pathway within the CJS generally. So I'm a forensic and clinical psychologist. I've been working with people with autism in the CJS for many years now, and I often find that, that quite often people have come through the process, often on a Part 3, when I see them, often on a Part 3 Mental Health Act order, and it's at that point then sometimes that the ASD features actually get picked up when they get a more detailed assessment when they're in the mental health system. So I think there is an issue around, you know, when people get seen, and the ability of clinicians and other people in the CJS to pick up on those very subtle indicators rather than the kind of more kind of stereotypical features of ASD, I guess. So it was just more of a comment really, and to say thank you for your
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Anybody? Anything you want to ask Simon or Felicity or Sally, Charlotte or John?
So here's one more question. So this one is for Felicity, and it's from Christian Bolke. He says, what is your experience of courts appointing intermediaries for defendants with communication or neurodevelopment concerns?
Okay, so the question relates to procedural justice, effective participation of people with autism. And for 10 or 15 years, I've been either on the management committee or an ambassador for the Advocates Gateway, which produces toolkits for advocacy with vulnerable people. And Penny Cooper, who runs the Advocates Gateway, invented the intermediary system. And the intermediary system is a system whereby people with expertise in communication, so it might be a speech pathologist or a child psychologist, who have those types of expertise, who are used not as experts, but to provide reports on how we should ask questions of persons. Here the example is with autism, and how the court might need to be adjusted in those special measures that we talked of earlier on. And so I've got over a decade's worth of experience of defending and indeed prosecuting cases which involve what we label vulnerable persons and includes people living with autism, including, for example, in a terrorism trial. So I have represented someone living with autism who is accused of terrorism, and part of the evidence against them is their stuff on their phone. And trying to move a terrorism trial to understand a person with those types of vulnerabilities is a pretty difficult task for a defence barrister. And I think we got the headline "fish brain terrorist" because that was what his brother called him. They just called him a fish brain. So you can Google the fish brain terrorist. So it's very that he didn't have an intermediary, but intermediaries are really useful for assisting people to communicate in criminal trials, and I think they're really valuable. I think I'll give you this example. Sometimes with children, you're asked, if it's a case involving a road traffic accident, for example, you're asked to use a toy car. But you have to say to some of them, well, you're grown up now, you know, it's a bit embarrassing to use a car. Now try doing that with an adult who to live with autism without being discriminated against. And it might help them to use a car to explain what was happening, but you really need someone who can meet them in advance, not to discuss their evidence or coach them, but to find out with dignity and respect what would help them give evidence, so that by the time I ask them the question, I'm not humiliating them. So I think intermediaries are really useful for a range of assistance to ensure that people with disabilities, people living with autism, can effectively participate and are entitled to their opportunities to defend themselves or to give evidence as witnesses in court.
Thank you, Felicity. Just looking at some of the comments here as well, there's some, I think Trevor asked the question of the population of autistic people within prison, and some very, very helpful responses. And if I can just respond to, I think it's Pippa's question, asking whether this session is going to be available to the others that unfortunately couldn't join because of the gremlins that made the noise and kept everyone out, unfortunately. But this is being live streamed now on YouTube, and it's going to be uploaded straight away afterwards. So it is accessible for everyone who unfortunately wasn't able to join the session due to our unwanted friends. We've got 5 minutes left. I do want to leave the final words perhaps to Sally and Charlotte. But if anyone's got any final question for Felicity or for John, or even for Sally and Charlotte.
Sorry, for us to speak, was it?
Yeah, I thought I'd leave the final words to you two.
Oh, cool. Well, yeah, so as Felicity said, we've got the mercy petition. Actually, at the moment, I'm trying to get as many letters of support as possible in support of the petition for Alex's pardon. So if you're a psychologist or psychiatrist watching and you think that the Court of Appeal wrongly refused to accept Alex's diagnosis of autism and that he should have a successful pardon, please contact me. My email is charlottemayhenry@outlook.com, and I'll be grateful for any letters of support that I can get from experts.
And I've put a link to the petition in the chat.
Fantastic, fantastic. Okay, well, I just want to draw this to a close now and thank everyone so much for participating. Sorry for the early technical glitches, which I hope didn't dampen the experience too much. And like I say, this is live streamed. It is going to be available on YouTube. I think it it just highlights the complexities of the relationship between autism and criminal justice. It's the sort of topic that you can speak about endlessly, and we probably need several more conferences to really get to the nuts and bolts of it. So I'd like to thank you all very, very much. I'd like to say a big thank you again to Juliana and her team. This is their fair. They've organised this, and they're a group of students from 6 different continents, I believe, in 8 different countries that have put this all together. It's the first year they've done it. I think you've done a wonderful job. Well done. Thank you everyone for contributing, for listening, and I think on that note we'll sign out. But keep well everyone, and thanks again.
Excellent.
Take care.
Thanks for watching, guys.